Hi, this is Bob Wells here, and welcome to Undercurrent Stories. This is the show where we hear about people's interests and uncover some fascinating stories at the same time. I hope you enjoy today's show. It's not every day that you get the opportunity to speak to somebody who's attempted to climb Mount Everest, and even less so to somebody who's climbed it twice. However, today I'm fortunate enough to speak to someone who's done that very thing. And here to tell us about those climbing achievements is Serena Brocklebank. Hello and welcome to Undercurrent Stories, Serena.
Hello, lovely to speak with you.
It's great to have you on. I'm very grateful for our mutual friend, Ben Wilding, for introducing us.
As am I.
Obviously, we're going to talk about your interest in mountaineering, Serena, but just for listeners' benefit, can you tell us a little bit about your life's journey, what it was like growing up, and what sort of made you, or what got you into mountaineering to begin with?
I had a fairly adventurous childhood, really, in that I had fairly adventurous parents who had what I would sometimes teasingly call quite a laissez-faire style of parenting back in the 1970s, and we were just allowed to run around and pretty much do what we wanted to do. So you could say borderline feral, but as being a member of a family with 3 children and with lots of local friends, we just would have a great time running around the woods, camping in the garden, clambering over things, and just generally, getting dirty and muddy and getting into misadventures and scrapes and somehow getting out of them. And I think some of those early experiences that you can have around risk and calculating risk, that we talk about, in later life. And sometimes the problem for children today can be a little bit that they can find that they're almost overly protected and find it hard to take risks. And I didn't quite realize at the time that I had the kind of childhood where I think I was learning on the hoof a lot to take risks. So I think I was quite a bold girl, and would probably at the time have just been called a tomboy, but just really enjoyed outdoor adventures. I would camp in the garden whenever I could, and I grew up really through the scouting system too, the guide and the scouting system. So I went to brownies, I went to guides, I looked across at what my brother was doing in scouts and thought, he seems to be having a lot more fun than me, certainly more adventure than me. So as soon as I could, I joined the Venture Scouts. And really in Venture Scouts, I got into climbing and sailing and kayaking, things like that. And that led me to Outward Bound, actually. I won a place on an Outward Bound course as a student through doing an event at Scouts where I'd raised a lot of money for the RNLI by doing a sponsored row down the River Thames, raised a lot of money for the RNLI, and my so-called prize at the time was a place on an Outward Bound course. Now, even for me then, I thought, Outward Bound, that sounds like boot camp. I'm not sure about that. But I went along on a 3-week course. I absolutely loved it. That was in Abu Dhabi in Wales as a student. And so straight after university, I was supposed to be being a lawyer. I did a law degree, but straight after university, I ended up going back to Outward Bound to work as a trainee instructor. And that is where I met Ben and Deb Wilding.
I see.
So you've got quite an introduction there, but that brought me to Outward Bound. And Outward Bound was very much a place that broadened your horizons in so many ways, not only just, physically, geographically, and just really enjoying the outdoors and playing in the outdoors and appreciating it, but just meeting all kinds of people from all walks of life and hearing about their adventurous stories and being inspired by other people as well. And, there were some pretty bold people working at Outward Bound. I remember meeting a chap there who was off to climb Makalu, and so it suddenly felt like something was there within the realms of possibility, really.
I did an Outward Bound a long time ago, actually, for 3 weeks in Lochiel, near
Oh,
Fort William
yes,
in
in
Scotland.
Scotland.
And
That's the really hardcore one.
well, yeah, absolutely, and it
Yeah.
was. I mean, some of the activities were fantastic. Abseiling, climbing mountain, or climbing very large hills, and we did this thing called a solo, which is you basically went on your own for 24 hours. They left you by a stream with, I
That's
think it was
right.
a Snickers
Yeah.
bar or a marathon, as it was called then in the 1970s. And I just remember just being accompanied by midges.
That's right.
That was the only thing. But yeah, so just for any overseas listeners, perhaps who aren't familiar with Outward Bound, could you just sort of describe what an Outward Bound is, please?
So Outward Bound started as an organisation back in the 1940s by an educator called Kurt Hahn, who was trying to help young men who were preparing to go to war in 1940, and particularly young sailors, and noticed that that one thing was trying to get them physically fit enough, but one thing they noticed was that they didn't seem to be very resilient in their characters. And so he developed these Outward Bound courses really as a way of trying to bring on young people. So these were 16-year-olds really, who were on the cusp of adulthood, suddenly had major responsibilities being thrust on them by sending them off to war, but trying to develop their character and their personal skills in a way that would encourage them to be far more adaptable in different situations. So they were encouraging them to be good team players, encouraging them to show good leadership skills, and they would do this by using the outdoors as a medium to that. Now, that's obviously quite serious beginnings, serious origins, but I think it sort of developed into a much more joyful purpose, really, too, which was about really being exploratory with your enjoyment of the outdoors. So certainly for a lot of children who came from inner city environments, it could be the first time they'd ever tried rock climbing or sailing or kayaking, or just even been out in the hills or camped. The sort of things that some people might take for granted in their childhood. Really realizing that a lot of children had never had that opportunity. So really having fun in the outdoors, but also really learning a lot about themselves and how they cope in these different situations outside of a school setting. Yeah.
Yes, and I remember when I went on my course a long time ago, there were people there from the inner cities who'd never really set foot in sort of open countryside like that with mountains. And it was a revelation. And I know what you mean about the self-confidence it can build. I mean, you go up you do some rock climbing. You really get a sense of achievement when you've gone up there.
Absolutely.
And particularly abseiling, when you've got to go down backwards.
Yeah.
And the trust that you have in the rope
Yeah.
and everything. But
So it's all of those things. It's the thrill, the adrenaline,
yeah.
and the sense of achievement. But like you say, I mean, rock climbing, I think, is just such a fabulous metaphor, really, because, the trust you have to place in the person who's belaying you and controlling the abseil, the fact that you just focused on that particular activity at the time. So everything else it goes out of your mind. So I think there are real meditative qualities to it as well. But just also the delight for particularly for young people of discovering, I'm actually really good at something that I didn't think that I would be good at, and surprising themselves and stretching themselves and learning to take those calculated risks, like we say. And we often talked with the students in terms of it's all too easy to live your life in the comfort zone, and actually you want to push out into the stretch zone because that's how you grow. But be careful of placing yourself in the panic zone, because if you put yourself in that situation, then you feel unsafe and then you retreat back to a very small comfort zone, and then you find yourself, not taking risks at all.
Yes.
So I think you could really illustrate in practical circumstances and by doing actual activities, what we mean by that kind of theory about personal development and personal growth, which can all sound a bit buzzwordy, perhaps over a podcast or whatever. But when you're actually doing activity, and particularly shared activity with other team members, I think people learn all kinds of really interesting lessons.
Yeah, we've had a couple of people on the show, adventurers who've done these sorts of things, and they work with people, not just sort of in a forum where they're talking about it, where they actually take them out and they they actually see the guys enjoying it and coming back absolutely enthralled by it. So on to Everest. I mean, not just up once, up twice, but doing my research, I see that this is almost like a family tradition.
It is indeed. So having described the background that I had in terms of having quite a sort of, adventurous family and one that allowed us to be adventurous, very specifically when it came to Everest, the inspiration really was my grandfather, Tom Brocklebank. So he attempted Everest back in 1933. So that was only the fourth ever attempt on Everest.
Wow.
So it was obviously 20 years before Everest was actually successfully climbed to the summit. As far as we know, there was certainly a successful expedition in terms of the climbers returning. It's still uncertain whether the summit was reached in 1924 by Mallory and Irvine. But anyway, obviously Ed Hillary and Tenzing Norgay returned to tell the tale in 1953. So my grandfather was on the 1933 expedition. So that was the one after Mallory and Irvine in 1924. Yeah. So at the time that my grandpa went, they still really didn't know whether Everest was A, climbable, and B, survivable if you did manage to climb it. So I think I was very inspired from a young age at hearing about these stories and just really realizing how pioneering it was really for my grandfather to find himself on one of those expeditions. Sadly, he did die when I was quite young, so I didn't actually get to hear many of the stories directly from him. Yeah. But I did become, very interested in Everest as a young adult, and I would read quite a lot about it. I read about his 1933 expedition, the official account. And I would hear stories from my father and my aunt Tess, particularly about my grandfather. So, it definitely helps to have some direct inspiration in the family.
Yeah. And when was the moment that you said to yourself, right, it's been, I've got this desire. I guess that you had a desire, and then it became, I guess you must have had a particular switch that went on and said, right, I want to do this now. When did that happen?
So I think specifically the moment of thinking about it was in 1999. I went on an expedition to Everest Base Camp. I say expedition, a trek to Everest Base Camp with a friend of mine, Aileen, an old university friend. And it was my first time going to Nepal. And I carried the book of my grandfather's 1933 expedition with me on that trip to read it on the trip. I have to say, these books, even if you've got a grandfather who features in them, they are a bit of a dry read. They're quite turgid, these old mountaineering books. Yeah. So I thought, to give it my best shot and my best concentration, to read it actually in the setting of the Himalayas would certainly bring it all to life a lot more. I did also read it alongside a book called Rum Doodle. If you ever come across that, it's a hilarious read. It's a spoof about the early Everest expeditions. And so it is very funny to read, a sincere account of what happened, and then a spoof book as well that sort of sends up these these English gentlemen who go off to conquer the Himalayas, really. So anyway, I just had a lovely time on the Everest Base Camp trip at the time. It was actually quite a tough trip because the weather conditions were really against us, but it really excited me being out in that environment and with the background that I'd had in mountaineering beforehand through Outward Bound. I mean, I say mountaineering, in a conditional way, mountain expeditions really in Snowdonia and leading treks, but then getting into climbing a lot more, going to the Alps and just being up in Scotland, places like that, just really enjoying being in the mountains. I did start to think, well, I wonder if I could progress to something, like Everest, really. But I didn't dare have a conversation with anybody about it for a good couple of years, I don't think. Yeah.
I guess actually going to base camp is quite a big expedition in itself.
Well, it is really. So I don't underestimate that. When people tell me that they've been to base camp and they ask me if I've been, and I say yes, and then I try not to burst their bubble by mentioning too quickly that I've actually been to the summit, but it gets to a point in a conversation where it feels a bit disingenuous to not tell people that I've been to the summit as well, and they say, oh well, getting to base camp must seem trivial to you then, and I often say no, it's a really big deal getting to base camp. It's it's high altitude. It's nearly as high as Kilimanjaro. Well, not quite, but it's 5,400 meters at base camp. And
not to be underestimated then.
It's not to be underestimated,
No.
and it's not to be taken lightly. And, I think people sometimes get this impression that mountaineers are just helicoptered into base camp, and you just can't do that. Altitude is a real issue, and also the journey. Certainly on the Nepal side, it's 10 days of hiking, up and down hiking to get there, and it's quite arduous in places, but that's actually a good thing. Those 10 days to get there, because you're acclimatizing.
Of course. Did you have guides on that stretch to get to base camp? Do you need guides?
Not necessarily. No. I mean, it's up to you. Some people now, on the whole, if they're taking a holiday trip there, will go with guides and they'll take Sherpas with them. But the first time I did it with my friend, we carried everything ourselves and went without a guide. It's quite straightforward. In terms of the route, it's quite straightforward. Altitude is more the issue, really.
Yeah.
And when altitude kicks in, suddenly a fairly heavy rucksack can feel like a 1 ton weight on your back if you're struggling.
So no bottles of champagne like the gentleman in the 1920s had them.
No, my grandpa's expedition, and this is what is beautifully set up in Rum Doodles. They were literally provisioned by Fortnum and Masons.
Wow.
In London, so they weren't short of champagne.
And what's that book that you features your granddad?
The book. So the book that features my grandfather is the proper Everest 1933 account that was written by Hugh Rutledge, who was the Everest leader at the time.
I see.
So my grandpa features in that. But the spoof book is called Rum Doodle by, I think the author was called W.E. Bowman. And that was written in the 1950s. And he drew a lot of his inspiration from those early expeditions, including my grandpa's 1933 expedition, apparently. And it's sort of written a little bit in the style of Jerome K. Jerome, Three Men in a Boat.
Okay, so probably something that keeps your spirits up when you've had a hard day.
And it's hilariously funny. It is.
And then you got back, but you hadn't yet decided to do the full ascent when you got back.
Oh no, no. I mean that at that time I'd only just gone to Everest Base Camp, so I certainly felt inspired to do more climbing, and go back to the Himalayas and do things like Island Peak, which is 6,000 meters, and Mira Peak, which is 6,400 meters
Yes.
in the Himalayas. And I went off to climb Kilimanjaro, which is 6,000 meters. And then I went off to climb Aconcagua in South America. I didn't make it up the first time in South America. That's on the border of Chile and Argentina, Aconcagua, and that's because the wind conditions were so fierce and it was so bitterly cold on our summit day that we couldn't safely push for the summit.
How does it feel? How does it feel when you have planned for major trips like these, and then something happens at the end where you can't actually do what you went out to do? How does it feel?
Oh, it's very testing. Something that you said at the beginning, actually, about me climbing twice on Everest. I don't know if you know this, but I didn't actually get to the summit the first time around. Got very close to it, but not to the summit. So my first expedition was from the north side, from the Tibetan side, and that was the route that my grandfather took. The second time, 2 years later, was from the Nepal side. So, so I went through all of those experiences, not just the first time around on Aconcagua of not making it to the summit, and that's a mountain that's about 7,000 meters, and feeling, oh gosh, if I can't make that, how am I going to make Everest, which is even nearly 2,000 more meters? But you just having to be philosophical that sometimes it's just not your day. And if the weather and the conditions aren't with you on that day, or something's gone wrong in the team or with the equipment or with your personal health, then you just have to be very philosophical about it. I would say one of the kind of almost growing up experiences around Everest has been, and the journey to Everest is coping with disappointment along the way. You know.
And I guess that must happen to a lot of mountaineers.
Sometimes people have said to me, they've said, "Oh, it's great that you managed to get to the summit the second time around, after having failed the first time. It must have been really disappointing for you the first time around." And I say to them, we have to be very careful around the word fail, because people obviously feel very disappointed to not make it. But certainly my experience the first time around was it was actually a very brave decision to turn around when you are so close to the summit, because survival is obviously the most important thing.
Yes, of course.
And it is not a failed expedition to return to base camp alive.
No.
You are coping with your disappointment, obviously, and that's a huge amount of time that you've set aside to go and do something. It's a lot of resources, it's a lot of money, it's a lot of gearing up to something, but you live to tell the tale, and you live to have the opportunity to try it again.
Yes.
And I would say that a lot of people get into difficulties on Everest, and still the death count, sadly, to be grim about it, is a lot higher than it should be still, because people find it hard to make that braver decision, you could argue, of denying their summit opportunity, when they might just be moments away from it, a few hundred meters away from it, but knowing that it would be unsafe to carry on.
Yes.
And to actually turn back is often the braver and the bolder decision. And Outward Bound and the Outward Bound philosophy cuts right through all of that. So I think all of those sort of early experiences that I had as an Outward Bound student, but also try to instill in other Outward Bound students, was very relevant around all of that too.
I think that's a great way of looking at life, isn't it? And the challenges that we have in life is that sometimes you might be going for the goal and it'd be great to get it, but actually it's the journey to it which is really got the true meaning.
And to not give up either, to cope with that disappointment. And I have been fortunate enough to meet Bear Grylls on a few occasions, and I just think he has lovely messages for people, and he gave it to me personally as well. Just, just don't give up,
No,
just
no.
keep going, don't give up.
Yeah.
And by that, he doesn't mean, you have to make the summit on the first attempt,
No.
but don't give up in terms of your spirit. If you are beaten back, keep going at it, and you will meet obstacles on the way. And
Yeah.
he gave me lots of lovely warning around the kind of obstacles that I would face, less to do with the mountain, but more around just being part of a very intense expedition. And he said, you will get, beaten back in all kinds of ways, psychologically, emotionally, and in your spirit. Not just physically, but just try and have the faith and keep going.
Serena, I'd like to talk about the sort of practical aspects of that,
Yeah.
of when you first went to Everest,
Yeah.
or when you first prepared for it. Going back to the point where you decided to do Everest, I'd like you to tell me when that was, and also what the preparation is like, how you set about the funding, the fitness training, and the getting everything together, the equipment and stuff. Can you just tell us a bit about that, please?
Sure. So having gone to the Himalayas and done the Everest Base Camp trek, and then just slowly building up my high altitude experience, I was really just checking in with myself. How did I cope at altitude before I, decided to commit to Everest? Because you can get people who are, very experienced climbers, very technically good climbers, very fit people. I'm not claiming to be a super fit athlete, but you can get people who are very experienced, but then just unfortunately find that they don't do very well at altitude. So I didn't want to put myself in a situation where I was going to definitely plan to go ahead to Everest if that was going to be a problem. So Aconcagua really was a test of that. So I attempted Aconcagua in 2003. I'd already made preliminary inquiries with an expedition company that was based in the Lake District, and I knew of them through Outward Bound links as well. So they kind of approved of my background, really, that I'd done a lot of, that I was technically in a good position with all my work through Outward Bound and all the other expeditions that I'd done. And they said, the main thing for you will be testing yourself at altitude. So just to, build up a bit more of a portfolio at higher altitude, which I did. I climbed with them on Aconcagua, and they said, that they thought I actually did very well at altitude, and it was just the windy conditions at the time that beat us back. So they gave me the confidence to feel that I could go and attempt Everest the following year. So 2004 was my first attempt on Everest, and I attempted it from the Tibetan side, like I mentioned before, because that was the route that my grandfather tried. And so really in between Aconcagua in, I think that was around October, November 2003 to April of 2004. That's 6 months. I just lived and ate and breathed Everest in terms of the preparation at that point. And it's an expensive business. There's no doubt about it. But I just called on all my resources and friends and colleagues, not only people I'd known from Outward Bound, but there was a great colleague from Rally International. I worked at Rally International for a couple of years, a chap called Stephen Jones, who was an expedition leader there. And he also worked in the Antarctic for quite a few seasons. So he was really good at knowing everything there was to know about the right kind of equipment for extreme cold, basically. So he came around to my flat a couple of times, and we just spread all the equipment I had on the floor, and he told me, what I needed to get and where I could try and get it from a bit more cheaply, but the sort of things that I shouldn't scrimp on, and I remember him saying your extremities are the bits you should not scrimp on in terms of quality. So really, really good quality gloves, really, really good quality boots. And when I say gloves, there are about 4 or 5 different types of gloves you have to have, obviously, the good thermal layers, and then medium wind stopper gloves, and then really serious high altitude mountaineering mitts on top of that. You have to think about having spares, because things can get dropped down crevasses really easily. Same with the boots, and you've obviously got to have seriously good hiking boots, and then ice climbing boots for the middle section, and then really top high altitude. Well, they look like moon boots, but they're actually very technical high altitude boots, and those were my most expensive bit of equipment at the time. They were £500.
And this was back in 2003
2004, yeah.
Wow.
And I have quite small feet, and so I couldn't borrow off anybody else, because also I didn't know of any other women who had attempted Everest or done this sort of high altitude stuff. So I was mainly relying on the help of male colleagues and friends, and obviously none of them had size 5 shoes. So I did have to buy that. I remember renting a down suit that my mother thought was hilarious when I tried it on for the first time, because she thought I looked like a Teletubby, one of these big down suits. And I really did, because again, it was designed for men. So it was very long in the body.
Yes.
So, it was a bit saggy round by my knee area, but obviously it looked far more professional once I'd actually got a harness on and a rucksack on. But it did look very funny. But I rented that the first time around. The second time around, because I had been living in Nepal for the second expedition, I actually had a lot of contacts out in Nepal then, and I had a made-to-measure down suit done in Nepal at a fraction of the price that it would have been to get it done in the UK. Yeah.
And so tell us about the beginning of the trek. Obviously, you have to go up to base camp first.
Yeah. So the attempt in 2004, like I mentioned, I wanted to follow my grandfather's route. They could only climb from the Tibet side back in 1933, because Nepal was actually completely closed to foreigners then. Yes. So they could only approach from that side. And I'll just tell you very briefly their journey, because it sounds so romantic, really, and a proper journey. They sailed from Southampton round to Calcutta. They then took the train from Calcutta up to Darjeeling. They walked from Darjeeling for 6 weeks to what became base camp on the Tibetan side. I, however, got driven in a Land Rover round to base camp.
Yeah.
And that's 5,200 meters on the Tibetan side. So you may remember I said earlier that actually the Nepal side, you walk in for 10 days to get to base camp, which is actually a much better acclimatization program.
Yeah.
On the south side, you're being driven across the vast Tibetan plateau to get to base camp. So you have to stop quite a bit on the way, but people often feel pretty unwell when they get to base camp.
I was going to say 5,000 meters.
5,200 meters, yeah. So I had already done a little bit of acclimatizing in Nepal on that side. Oh, actually, a little interesting segue I should tell you is that I arrived at base camp on the Tibetan side a week later than all of my colleagues, which might sound a little bit remiss of me. We were all in Kathmandu together, and the local Nepal agency was sorting out our visas, the visas with the Chinese, for us to go to Tibet. And we had a BBC team with us at the time, and they were a little bit nervous that the Chinese might not be very happy about a BBC team going in, because it can be all a bit sensitive about Tibet. And we were told the night before we were all due to leave that everybody's visa had been approved, including the BBC team. The only person that wasn't approved was yours truly, Serena Brocklebank.
Oh dear.
And that was because I worked for the Foreign Office at the
I
time.
see.
And
Yeah.
the Chinese government were a little uncertain as to what my motivations were for going into Tibet. So I had to do a week of very intense diplomacy with the consul in Kathmandu at the time.
Which I guess you must have been good at because you were a diplomat anyway, weren't you?
Yes, but even this took me by surprise, and I was
Yes.
saying, no. I really just want to be a very selfish mountaineer and just go and climb the mountain. There is no ulterior motive. So John Chick was the name of the consul at the time at the British Embassy. He was very helpful in getting his Chinese colleagues at the Chinese Embassy in Kathmandu to give me a visa to go. But it meant that I was a week behind everybody else, which was actually an extremely stressful start to the expedition.
Yes, I can imagine.
Because they'd already had their few days settled in base camp to acclimatise. They'd already set off up the mountain. And it was quite some time before I catch them up, because I was, out of sync with them, but I couldn't rush to go up.
No.
So I did have a little bit of company, but it was quite a lonely experience to start with. So I had to remember that tomboy child who was good about being on her own and being quite bold, because the first few days on Everest, I was literally hiking on my own up to advanced base camp.
Yeah. What, with your equipment or with a Sherpa?
Well, on my own actually, but the equipment, the serious equipment gets moved up by the Sherpas anyway.
Yes.
But so the tents and things like that. But I was carrying my stuff on the acclimatization roads.
What type of weight would you typically carry then as you're going up the mountain? What sort of weight?
We would be as light as possible, but around 15 kg, something like that.
Not too bad, but still enough to hold you back a bit.
If you're pushing up to 20 kg, you would really feel it. But you would obviously have to carry your clothing, your emergency supplies, your sleeping bag, a mat, some emergency food, and water is always the heaviest thing.
Yes.
Because you've got to have plenty of water. That's all part of the acclimatization process as well, keeping your circulation going well. And you can only do that if you're properly hydrated.
You met your team?
Met my team and only really got into sync with them by about the week 6 of a 10-week expedition. Something like that. So no, it was perhaps a little bit before then, but anyway, I did link up with them eventually. And the thing about climbing on Everest is people sometimes wonder, why does it take a couple of months to climb Everest? If altitude wasn't an issue, it would perhaps take you 1 week to climb it, 5 days up, 2 days down.
Yeah.
But altitude is an issue. If you tried to do it 5 days up, well, you wouldn't get very far at all before you slipped into a coma and slipped away.
Yeah.
So your body has to slowly acclimatize. And so you end up having to travel up and down the mountain several times to bank that acclimatization. So you'll go from base camp up to advanced base camp and then come back down again and then up to advanced base camp again and up to camp 1, and then you'll come back down to advanced base camp and then up to camp 2 and then all the way back down to advanced base camp and then maybe all the way back down to base camp again. You're yo-yoing up and down the mountain. And
wow.
And they reckon by the time you climb to the summit, in terms of distance covered, you've climbed Everest, 4 or 5 or 6 times by that.
Yeah. How many hours a day would you be doing that?
Yeah, well, that's the thing, you see, because when you're first say when you're at advanced base camp and you're going up to the North Col.
Yeah.
The North Col is at 7,000 meters, and advanced base camp was 6,400 meters. So it's only 600 meters up. I say only 600 meters up, but the very first time you do that, it could take you 9 or 10 hours because you've got to do it so slowly, because you're touching new heights all the time. But
Yes.
by the time you've done it on the third occasion, you might be able to get up there in a couple of hours.
And do you feel your breathing and your oxygen intake and the whole process in your body gradually acclimatizing?
Absolutely, you do. So when you go down to base camp, having done some of these higher altitude rounds, you almost feel a bit giddy and drunk on the oxygen levels down there. And you think, hang on a minute, a few weeks back, I was struggling to breathe at base camp.
Yes.
And so that's just how much your body is changing, but it takes time. And in brief, the science behind that is your red blood cells are having to multiply to take on board more oxygen, to compensate for the fact that in the atmosphere there is less oxygen and more carbon dioxide, which is, obviously a more toxic combination. So your body is having to adapt to the lower oxygen levels by your red blood cells having the ability to take on board more oxygen in your body.
So this sounds like a naive question, but do you take oxygen up with you?
Not naive at all. So you're just naturally acclimatizing until about 8,000 meters. That's the whole idea. Yeah. There's nothing to stop people climbing from base camp with oxygen. Some people have done.
Yeah.
It's generally a bit disapproved of because it's seen as you're not really playing the game, because you're not allowing your body to sort of naturally adapt to the environment. But there's no rules about it. If you wanted to do that, you'd have to be a multimillionaire to do it because it would cost you so much money. I mean, each oxygen bottle was priced at, I think it was about £1,500 for each bottle at the time. And that is not just the bottle in itself and the cost of the bottle and the cost of the oxygen, but it's the shipping costs. So the shipping costs to get all those oxygen bottles shipped to base camp in the first place.
Yeah.
And then the transport costs, because this is where the Sherpas, and, it's so important to talk about the Sherpas, they do so much backup support. You do get some extraordinary mountaineers. They are the exception. People like Reinhold Messner, who have climbed Everest with no oxygen whatsoever and no Sherpa support. But they really, really are the exception, not the rule.
Yeah.
Most mountaineers, and certainly ones who, signed up to a commercial expedition, because that is what they are. You are signing up to a company that's providing you with the logistics. They are providing Sherpa support, equipment support and oxygen support, and you're just trying to get the balance right of how much of that you can afford to use and feels ethical to use, really.
Yes.
So I would say the average is people don't really get onto oxygen until they get to about 8,000 meters, maybe a bit below. South side of Everest, which is the Nepal side of Everest, we did start to use oxygen at 7,300 meters there at the camp then. But that's also partly because it's such a strenuous climb from 7,300 meters to the top camp.
At what point did you do the final ascent, Serena?
So, talking about that first expedition, the final push to the summit was about nearly 2 months into the expedition, and I was personally feeling really good and really strong and really healthy. Well, I say really healthy, it is all relative.
Yes.
We had a very strong mountain biker with us on this expedition who was being filmed by the BBC, and he had left the expedition a couple of weeks before because he said, I just don't feel fit enough. I don't
Oh, really?
feel like I'm firing on all 4 cylinders. And I remember saying to him, he said he felt he was only firing on 3 cylinders. And I said, 3 cylinders? That's really good in mountaineering terms. You're lucky if you're averaging between 2 and 3 cylinders. So there I was on my 2 cylinders at the top camp. This is metaphorically, not oxygen cylinders.
No, I realise that.
And feeling good for the summit. But unfortunately, the weather gods were not with us. And a seriously bad storm came in. And we were stuck in the top camp, those of us who were pushing for the summit, for 3 days.
Right.
And so we literally could not step outside the tent. It was a total snowstorm blizzard, very, very heavy winds. We had to make sure we weren't being buried alive by the snowdrifts. So every now and then we would have to just clear the entrance to the tent. And just stay put and try and sit out the storm. As time ticked on, we knew that even if the storm dropped, that we didn't at that point then have enough supplies to carry on because our oxygen supplies were dwindling, just staying put at 8,000 meters. Our food supplies were dwindling, and your body is effectively wasting away. You're in the charmingly called death zone. Anything above 7,500 meters is considered to be the death zone, and the general thinking is you shouldn't be above that height for more than 7 days. And we were already on, by the end of that storm, we were on day 6. So we could not risk going up to the summit when the storm eventually cleared. We couldn't do that final push to the summit. We had to use that final day for safety and for survival and to drop down.
Yeah, so you had to take that brave decision.
Yeah, that brave decision. In a way, it had got so extreme that I think it was a bit of a no-brainer, personally. Yeah. However, your brain is doing funny things at high altitude anyway. It's starved of oxygen. You desperately want to go to the summit. Your toy is the summit, and you want your toy. And people do throw their toys out of the pram a little bit if they can't have their summit, their achievement. And unfortunately, during that period, 11 people died who made the wrong decision and carried on trying to go to the summit. So it is so difficult to make that decision.
And these were people possibly that you'd met beforehand?
Yeah.
Dear.
On different expeditions, just trying to push through to the summit. And then just getting into trouble, either hypothermia, exposure, wind, being blown off the ridge on the way to the summit. It was just dreadful. And the communications obviously were really poor because of the storm. So people's radio systems weren't working properly. So terrible things might be happening even not that far away from where you are, but you're not even aware of it.
And how far away from the summit were you when you had to make that decision?
So we were at this point we were about 700 meters away from the summit.
Not far at all.
Yeah. In terms of height, that is. So still, a good push, still a day's climb. A good day's climb ahead of us, but we had to use that day to go down. And like I say, that's sometimes the harder decision and the bolder thing to do. And then we got back down to base camp, and only really the enormity of the tragedy that was going on for other teams unfolded at that point. And I think the rest of us felt, we're so lucky to be alive, glad to be off Everest, never, ever, ever again. But by the time we'd got back to Kathmandu, a few of us were already thinking, ooh, Everest on the south side from the Nepal side. How about it? And I've never had children, but maybe it equates a little bit to childbirth when you hear mothers talk about the pain of childbirth and go, never, ever, ever again. And then suddenly 2 years later, they find themselves having
So
another
you'd
baby.
made that decision when you came back down again to
Well, about a week later,
about a week. Yeah.
when we were back in Kathmandu, there was a little group of us, 4 of us, one who had links with an expedition leader on the south side, who said, "Oh, should we think about it?" And it took a couple of years, obviously, to amass the funds again to go on something like that and to gear up to it. And I do sometimes rather flippantly say, but it is a convenient way of describing it, having tried to climb Everest from my grandfather's side, and I did get higher up the mountain than my grandfather, but it was lovely to obviously follow in his exact footsteps up his side. That was wonderful to try that, but that Ed Hillary and Tenzing Norgay, they were onto something, climbing from the south side, from the Nepal side, and I just figured if I was mad enough to try it again, at least have a different experience.
So just before we talk about your trip up where you actually got to the summit,
Yeah.
a couple of years later, I'm intrigued into the decision-making process of deciding that you're going to come down again. You mentioned you had a team leader.
Yeah.
Is it very much the team leader who says, "Look, we really ought to do this," or is it almost democratic? Do you all have a chat about it? How does it work?
Well, the team leader was down at base camp. He was he'd become ill. He'd had a chest infection going up to the North Col, so he couldn't carry on. So he'd gone back down he was at advanced base camp, I think. So again, it's one of these situations where you have to be, very independent yourself about the decision. You're obviously making it with the Sherpas. There can be a difficult thing, I'll be honest too, that the Sherpas are sometimes in a tricky position. There's a bit of they really want to get what they would consider to be their mountaineering clients up to the summit, because that's good for their CV. They want to get a bonus for getting you up to the summit. I made it very clear to my Sherpa he was getting a bonus either way. It should not be linked to getting up to the summit. It should be about the safe decisions that are going on. So it really was about us as a group of teammates making the decisions of the few of us who were left in the team attempting up to the summit, because it was only about half of us at that point. And it wasn't straightforward. There were a couple of people who still wanted to head up. But then I think that, it just became an obvious decision that they wouldn't have had enough oxygen alone to get up to the summit if they
and I guess when they came down again, they'd heard what had happened.
Exactly.
Very thankful. So we're going to skip forward now, if you don't mind, to your trip.
Southside attempt.
I was going to say a successful trip, but actually they're both successful, as you mentioned earlier.
In different ways.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But should we put it more like when you actually assailed when you enter the summit? So can we go to the bit where you do the final ascent, if that's okay?
Yes.
Unless there's anything else that we ought to...
A little bit of background too, that I had rather cleverly manoeuvred a position, I like to think, at the British Embassy in Kathmandu in the run-up to the second expedition. So in 2005, I went to work as the Vice Consul at the British Embassy in Kathmandu. That job was actually lined up before my first attempt on the Tibetan side. But considering I was then aiming to climb in spring of 2006 on the Nepal side, it was extremely advantageous, me actually being in situ in Nepal for 15 months in the run-up to that. So any holiday time that I had, I was up there in the Himalayas. I was trekking and climbing, so that was great.
Yes.
So then I set off, and it was lovely to have the support of the British Embassy behind me too. They were very excited for me too. It was an easier start because of the acclimatization that I was telling you about, the natural acclimatizing that you get on the way to base camp. However, I had a horrendous chest infection just before going. So again, it looked slightly wobbly at the beginning of my Everest climb, whether I was going to be physically fit and healthy enough to start with. And in a nutshell, at the beginning of the expedition, the leader of that expedition, there were quite a few people who dropped out early on for health reasons.
Yes.
And he did have a bit of a question mark over me because he thought that maybe I wasn't going to be physically fit enough because of my chest infection to do it. I managed to persuade him to let me hang on in there as long as I promised to be really sensible and, not go too high too early on in the expedition.
Yeah.
And that worked in my favour. But it was really tricky. And, the words of Bear Grylls of you will have some obstacles and you will get some people objecting about you. And I don't mind saying too, I was the only female on both expeditions each time.
Oh, really?
And, that comes with a certain amount of baggage because they're not always the most enlightened of environments. Can I put it like that?
Yeah.
These base camps. And I think there can be a bit of an assumption, the female in the group will, be the burden and need to be supported and carried out.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
So, I had to do quite a lot of convincing people, but doing it in a gentle, low-key way that I was all right.
Yeah.
But there were times that was a bit of a lonely experience. But anyway, it came right in the end. It was a tricky beginning in terms of that chest infection, but I got stronger and stronger, and I started to acclimatise well. And my lovely Sherpa, a chap called Passanguru Sherpa, so he is a Sherpa by profession, but his family name was also Sherpa. He was great, and he spoke very little English. I had fairly rudimentary Nepali, but we got on really well together. And he was the one who gave me quiet confidence each day when we climbed.
Was he?
He only joined me, about 2/3 of the way through the expedition. You climb on your own to start with. And he would just say to me, he would call me Diddy, which means sister. He would say, "You climb really well today, Diddy." And it would mean the world to me, that I had the approval of my 23-year-old Sherpa. I was 38 at the time. But, if he was confident in me, that's what mattered because his life is at stake as well,
of
us
course.
going up to the summit. Very much so, that if he has a climber who doesn't know what she's doing and isn't ready to climb and can't make the right decisions and hasn't prepared properly and hasn't looked after herself properly, then I'm putting him in danger. So anyway, our climbing partnership worked well. We went, I'll zoom you forward 7 weeks really, to the point where we're at the top camp and we are heading up to the summit. And we get to the top camp at about 4 p.m, and we're going to be heading off at 9 o'clock that night because climbing Everest, the summit day can, be a very, very long day, effectively.
And what time of year was this, Serena?
So this is, it was 18th of May. So it's normally mid-May to late May. That is the very, very narrow window of opportunity for people to climb to the summit. So when you see these images, particularly in the British press, of, all those people crowding on Everest, that might be because there has just been one day in the whole year when it's been okay to climb to the summit in terms of the winds being at a lower.
So I didn't realise that. And I'm sure a lot of listeners wouldn't. What you're saying is that sometimes there can only be 1, maybe 2 days a year that you can actually, you've got that
Yeah.
window to do it.
And it normally falls between middle of May and end of May.
Right.
And what it's all about is Everest, most of the year, is totally unclimbable because the summit is sticking in the jet stream. And so the winds on the summit are 200 miles an hour.
Yeah.
So when people see images of Everest, you often see what looks like a cloud sort of streaming away from the summit. That isn't a cloud, it's snow being blasted off the summit.
Wow.
And often why, again, an image of Everest, it's just rock. And people wonder why, why isn't it a nice snowy glacier? And that's because snow never gets a chance to settle on it. When it snows on it, it's just blasted off straight away. So, yeah, Everest is unclimbable for most of the year, and it drops to a friendly 40 to 50 miles an hour in May time. So the day that I was setting off to the summit, so it's the night of the 17th of May at 9 o'clock at night, and the general thinking is climb up during the night. When you've got the most energy, you've rested for a bit. We haven't slept, obviously. You've just been resting nervously at the top camp. You're trying to hydrate, so you're melting snow, trying to hydrate. You're trying to eat, but you feel like you've got no appetite. The altitude really kills your appetite. I love chocolate, and I couldn't even face chocolate up there. That's how extreme it is.
Yeah.
And you set off during the night. And it's a very, very slow plod, and in places it's quite technical. There's a place called the Yellow Band. There's a place called the Hillary Step, where it suddenly gets really quite steep, and so it's technical ice climbing. Sometimes on bare rock, so you're wearing these crampons, but sometimes your crampons are then on bare rock, and so it can be tricky.
And you're all tethered together, are you?
No. You're just you're climbing alone, but with your Sherpa behind you. But there is fixed rope for most of the way up. Yeah. So a Sherpa team will have gone ahead at the start of that season. So it had only happened 2 days before I climbed up. When the weather had been good enough, again, the winds had been low enough for a team to fix ropes up to the summit. And that's, incredible Sherpas. And actually, my Sherpa had been part of that rope fixing team. He hadn't gone all the way to the summit because he was planning to accompany me a couple of days later. So, he obviously didn't want to waste all his personal resources by doing that. But,
just for listeners' benefit, I mean, it's we've all got pictures in our mind's eye as to what that final ascent is like. You know, how near the edge of the mountain are you? In other words, how dangerous is it that you can actually fall off?
Good question. Well, in a way, the nighttime can comfort you because you cannot see what you cannot see. So when you're first climbing, it's quite a broad but steep snow slope. So you don't feel like you're going to fall off sideways, put it like that. No. But then you get to a place called the balcony, which is at 8,500 meters. And then you are very much climbing on a ridge. And obviously we've got head torches on, but you're climbing by moonlight as well.
Yeah.
And then when I got to the Hillary Step, my head torch actually failed me at that point. It was so cold that the batteries obviously run down really quickly. I had spared batteries, obviously, in my backpack, but I made the decision that I didn't want to get those batteries out because I was on such a narrow part of the ridge at that point. And also risk, freezing my fingers against metal batteries trying to install them. So I just climbed up by moonlight up the Hillary Step. And when I got to the Hillary Step and I got to the summit, I'll tell you a bit about that in a minute. But when I returned, which was in daylight, and came down the Hillary Step, I thought, wow, it's just as well I almost couldn't see what was going on the other side there, because it was literally a 10,000 foot drop down the Kanshan face, just inches away from where I was climbing by moonlight, climbing up the Hillary steps.
It's certainly not for the faint-hearted, is
It's
it?
not for the faint-hearted. So at that point, ignorance was bliss, a
Yes, of
little bit.
course.
I mean, obviously,
Yeah.
I knew what was going on, but I couldn't really see, so I didn't have that
Yeah.
terrible sense of exposure. Only really, Bob, once I got over the Hillary step did I think, I'm going to make it to the summit. At no point before then did it feel like a guaranteed thing.
And how far, how far is the Hillary step from the summit?
In terms of meters of height, it's probably only a couple of 100 meters at that point in height.
And now for the pinnacle of our conversation,
Yes.
Serena, the peak of our conversation. Can you just describe what it was like on that final ascent?
Yes.
Please.
So what was wonderful was having climbed the Hillary step in the dark just by moonlight and getting to the top. And then it was a much more gentle slope to the summit. I not only realized I was going to make it to the summit physically and technically, but in terms of time really being on my side, because we'd set off at 9 o'clock at night. And the whole idea is that the turnaround time at the summit was 1 o'clock in the afternoon. Now, I was about to make it to the summit before 5 o'clock in the morning. So 8 hours before the safety turnaround time. So it was so pleasing to know that I'd been climbing so steadily and so comfortably that I was going to make it in good time. And can you imagine how pleasing it was to have my Sherpa tap me on the shoulder? It was actually quite hard to communicate because you've got oxygen masks on. It's very hard to communicate through all your equipment. Your goggles are frozen up. And he tapped me on the shoulder and he basically indicated to me that we needed to slow down because he said, we're going to get to the summit too early and we're going to be there in the dark and you won't be able to see anything. So this was brilliant news. So it was so nice to, take our time and slow down and literally get to the summit as dawn was rising. And at this point, there was only one pair of climbers ahead of us. We didn't realize that we'd actually got to the front of all of the climbers because we'd climbed slowly and steadily. And then this climber overtook us when I'd been fiddling about with my head torch. So a German climber who I shook hands with. I have no recollection of who he was, didn't really see his face, but shook hands with him. And he was on his way back down. Yeah. And then Passanguru and I got to enjoy the summit for 3/4 of an hour.
Oh, wow.
All on our own.
Just describe that last 10 meters where you could actually see. What is it? Is there's a flag at the top or something? Is that
there were a few prayer flags on the top that had been placed there by a Sherpa probably a couple of days before, because on the whole nothing survives on the top for very long. It gets whisked away. So lovely to be able to see these multicolored prayer flags in the distance, so to know that that's where the summit was, because the summit's actually a little bit rounded at the top, but it's only the size of the true summit is the size of a kind of a bench that two people could sit on. It is quite a narrow summit, but it's not a pointy summit. So it's so lovely to see that in the dawn that was coming through, to get there and to then slowly see dawn. And in terms of the description of the emotion, ecstatic, euphoric, just really the most ecstatic feeling I'd ever had in my life. And it was really, really lovely to feel those emotions, because some people say that you can actually feel quite numb at the summit, because if it's been so exhausting to get up there and terrifying, if you know that your margin is very, very narrow and that really you should be turning around, or arguably should have turned around already, some people have the experience of just, touching the summit, bagging the summit and saying, right, that's it, we've got to go down now, and not really even able to enjoy it. So we were up there on our own for 45 minutes.
Oh, what an experience. And it must have been great seeing the sun come up.
Seeing the sun come up and seeing, seeing the shadow of Everest as well, because you can imagine the shadow of Everest being the biggest shadow in the world, stretching out for miles in front of you because the sun's coming up behind you. Seeing literally the curve of the earth. You can see it with your naked eye from up there. Seeing, throughout the night, but seeing it at dawn as well. You're seeing all these electric storms that are happening all around you. And so when you're climbing up, that can be very nerve-wracking. You think, oh my God, is there an electric storm near me? But because you're so high up, you're possibly witnessing an electric storm that might be happening in the Karakorums in Pakistan. It's that far away from you.
Yeah.
But also what you're seeing beneath you is a sea of cloud beneath you. So my colleagues who were down at base camp, because half the mountain expedition team were going up in the second wave, so they were all down at 5,400 meters at base camp. They thought we were having a hideous time because it was snowing heavily at base camp, but that's because the cloud line and the snow line was hovering around 6,000 to 6,500 meters.
Yeah.
So they were under heavy snow, whereas we were above the clouds. So a bit like that experience that people have when they're on long haul flights and you're above the clouds and you're just bathed in sunshine in the aeroplane above the clouds. That's what it was like for us. And Absolutely. So for me in Anecdotes, and you're looking at just the very highest mountains in the world, piercing through this sea of clouds. So they're looking like little, volcanic islands with snow streaming off the top of the island. So looking like, steaming volcanoes in a sea of cloud. It's just beautiful, so breathtaking. I absolutely loved it. And I could get to a point where my breathing was calm enough to be able to take off my oxygen mask. So obviously Agner and I took some photos, very, rudimentary camera that I had at the time. And I had a little backup disposable camera in case the battery on my camera had, collapsed in the extreme temperatures. It was minus 32 up there, I think. So it's pretty damn cold. And yeah, it was lovely. And then my Sherpa had to drag me away. And he was saying, come on, Diddy, we've got to get down now. We've been up here for 3/4 of an hour. And some other people from our team were starting to come up at that point. So, this sounds a bit show-offy, but it's just a fact that we all left at the same time at 9:30 at night, I think it was. But I was on the summit a couple of hours before any other members of my team. And it was not because I was going particularly fast, but it is totally, and what I would almost like to, leave you on really in terms of an image. It's totally the story of the hare and the tortoise. And I often talk to school groups and about climbing Everest, and particularly trying to encourage young girls to, and I say it absolutely pays to be the tortoise and not the hare. So there'd been quite a few doubts about me at the beginning because I seemed quite slow, but I would say that I was just being steady. And I would say to people, it's not a race because it isn't a race. It's not a competition. Don't buy into the competitive ego elements that are all around you at base camp, and some of the sort of, alpha male qualities that can be around and can egg you into a performance that doesn't feel comfortable for you, because then if you become the hare, you will just deplete your resources and collapse. And that's what was happening on the summit day. Literally, people would go up fast, but then they would have to stop and rest for 20 minutes, half an hour. Whereas we just went steadily. And that's so important. We barely rested, because we were going at a calm pace. So we would just pass the people who were going faster. So it was a very satisfying climb in terms of we felt we not only did it well and comfortably and safely, but we did it with style. and we were very, very blessed with fantastic conditions on the top.
Your description of the journey up, both on the the first ascent and this one in particular, and what you were saying about the bit where you got there at dawn and you were looking around, you could see the the clouds below you. You could see storms going on in places like Pakistan, and the feeling of elation, I'm sure, has come across to listeners. So thank you ever so much for coming on the show.
And just a very final thing I'd like to say, that I did at the top as well very much think about my grandfather at the summit. And again, it might sound like a bit of a cliche, but it felt like I had completed a bit of unfinished family business.
Yes.
So that was really, really lovely to have that sort of closing of the circle in terms of the Everest story in the Brocklebank family as well.
That's a lovely story, Serena. Thank you ever so much for coming on the show.
Thank you very much. That was a pleasure.
You have been listening to Undercurrent Stories. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Please feel free to share the show link to your friends and family, and if you have 60 seconds, I will be most grateful if you would please rate and review. To hear more episodes, please subscribe to the show and visit undercurrentstories.com. If you leave your email in the link, we will notify you as soon as new episodes are released. Also, check out our social media links, details of which can be found on the show notes. Until next time, this is Bob Wells wishing you all the very best.